Hi guys, here we are starting chapter 18. This will be our second to last chapter. We are finally to things that probably when we look at them we would say, okay, that's an animal. They are the ectothermic vertebrates. The vertebrate part should be pretty familiar to you. That just means that they have a backbone, they have a spine. The ectotherm is a little bit different because we are not one of these, but ectotherms are animals that use the environment to control their body temperature. So these are the animals that have to be in the sun. Excuse me, for example, if they want to raise their body temperature, this is why you see like turtles out on a log in a pond on a sunny day, or snakes out on the road. So they have to use the environment to control their internal temperature. And so the three big groups in this chapter are the fish. So obviously there's Nemo, the amphibians, and the common example of that is a frog, and then the reptiles. So there is that big snake. This, by the way, is the closest you'll ever see me to a snake of that size. So, so they're all familiar to you. We will do some dissections with these guys. We'll do a frog dissection and then a snake dissection, just so you can kind of see some of the internal stuff. All right, so these animals are all in phylum Chordata, and this is a phylum that is pretty broad, and they're really only put together in this group if they have the following characteristics, and they usually only have these characteristics as embryos, which means that some of them will not be nearly the same as when they're adults or things that we would recognize, but we scientifically would fall into this group also. So we do have some of these. And the first characteristic is a nerve cord. Now this is the first time that we've seen the nervous system basically, or this nerve cord on the back. So it is dorsal. It is a tube shape, or kind of just like a circular shape that runs all the way down the back. And as animals grow and as they develop, this would be known as the spinal cord. So this is what will eventually become a major part of the nervous system. Then these organisms as embryos also usually have what is called a notochord. And this is, again, on the back. It's a flexible rod that is also very strong. It supports the animal, helps in, like our case, to be upright, or it also is an attachment point for the rib cage and the shoulders and the hips and all that kind of stuff. And its job is to protect that nerve cord. And so in vertebrates, this structure eventually develops into the spine or the backbone. Then a couple that are a little kind of weird to us, pharyngeal pouches. These are folds of skin in the neck area. In like the fish, this would have slits in it. These folds would have slits in them that would allow water in and around the gills. And so they actually kind of stay and are an opening, like in tadpoles and that kind of thing, for breathing purposes. In land animals, these structures, or excuse me, these folds actually become part of the face and upper chest, some of the neck structures and muscles and those kinds of things. Then the last one is a post-anal tail, and this basically just means a tail that extends past the end of the body, or past the end of the digestive system. And in humans and in other animals, some of the great apes, and yeah, that's probably about it. Excuse me, this is a structure that disappears in early development, like by the time you're like 8 weeks old. And so, but because these are kind of the general characteristics, we still are put into phylum Chordata along with all these other animals. All right, so now our first group, the fish. Fish are aquatic animals. You probably knew that. They cannot survive out of water for very long because their gills need to have water not only on them but flowing over them. And this is how a fish breathes. So when you take a fish out of water and just leave it, you're essentially suffocating it. It cannot get the oxygen that it needs from the water. So three groups of fish. The first one, the cartilaginous fish. This is, these are animals like sharks and rays, so that top picture up there. These are animals that have skeletons that are made almost entirely of cartilage. And so a little bit different structure, still very structurally strong. Bone and cartilage can have almost the same density, depends on the type of cartilage, but they are unique in their cartilage structure. Then we have the bony fish. When you think of a fish, you're probably thinking of a bony fish. The picture I have there is a little sunfish. In these, the skeletons are made of bones, just like it sounds. And so the bones are pretty thin and small compared to most of your bones, but it is the same calcium-based structure. And then the last one, that is a jawless fish. This is the most unusual group, and it's kind of weird that it's put into phylum Chordata and then into the fish group, because some of them don't even have vertebrae. They don't even have a backbone. And they essentially live as parasites. And that picture right next to me, which again I would not be this close to in real life, is a hagfish. Some of these are also known as lampreys. They basically attach onto the bodies of sharks or larger fish and are just parasitic growths essentially on the sides. Okay, now the fish structures, most of these are going to apply to the bony fish because that's 95% of the fish group, but sharks will have some of these, the jawless fish will have some of these, but not all. Okay, so first of all, fins. Fish have an array of fins, from their dorsal fin on their back to a pectoral fin on their stomach. They have their fins on the sides, their tail fin, all kinds of things. And these are used to steer their bodies. They can use them to move in any direction, of course, mainly forward. And that is mostly due because that's the way they're looking, that's the way they want to go, but it also helps with their breathing and the gills. But so fins are used to move. Then scales. Most fish have scales. These scales again are used for protection, an outer layer that is a little bit stronger than just skin. They are used to make the body a little more streamlined, and so that helps with movement. They can be very brightly colored, very distinctive patterns, all those different kinds of things just depend on the species. But the scales themselves are pretty uniform. Fish do have a closed circulatory system, which means it's similar to yours. They have a chambered heart, and it has tubes that come off of it and extend throughout the body. Fish only have two chambers, one atria and one ventricle. And so they have one chamber to receive the blood from the body, that is the atria, and then one chamber that pumps the blood out to the body, and that is the ventricle. Fish have an operculum, the bony fish do, and this is a little covering over the gills, and it is used to draw in water or pump water over the gills from the mouth. If you've seen like cartoons of fish, or sometimes like actual like videos that are pretty good, they kind of flap like out from the sides of their face. I hope you love that little video of me doing that. And that is the operculum kind of opening and closing, and it draws water in through the mouth and kind of pulls it back over the gills. Then also in bony fish, they have a swim bladder, and this is just a little, like a little balloon inside the fish, and it fills with gases either from their digestive tract, so whatever food they're digesting, or even from the oxygen that they are taking in from the water, and it helps the fish to maintain what they call neutral buoyancy, which basically means that they stay at the same depth without floating up or sinking down. And so they don't have to constantly be swimming in a certain direction, or trying to stay right where they need to be. So that swim bladder helps with that. And then the jaws. Most fish have many teeth, and pretty sharp teeth, and that they use to capture their food and also to chew. They can have multiple sets of teeth, like sharks very often have several rows of teeth. And bony fish even most of them have a second set of jaws that is farther down in their throat that kind of, as food gets swallowed, does like a second chewing of their food. It just helps with continuing on with the digestion. Don't ever stick your hand in the mouth of a fish because they're pretty sharp. Same thing with the scales. I know that some of you in the fins have probably fished quite a bit in your life, and hopefully you have learned to not run your hand backwards over the fins, or to stick your fingers goes into their mouths because they are predators and they're there to survive, and they use those teeth for sure. Okay, so now reproduction. You probably have heard of spawning, and this is when a female will lay eggs and then the male comes along and releases sperm over those eggs. It's external fertilization. Most fish will return to a certain place to spawn. You probably have heard of the Alaskan salmon that will swim for thousands of miles and will swim up very specific rivers to the spot where they were born, basically, or where they hatched as eggs in order to spawn and to reproduce. So it is a very specialized place that they go for spawning, and it is very common and seasonal. There are some fish that do go through internal fertilization, and in this case, after fertilization happens, the male releases or injects sperm into the female's body. The female will lay the eggs, but she will lay them in a case, or like a little kind of like a little bundle, and it stays attached to their bodies very often, and those are called mermaid's purses, if you've ever seen that. Some carry live embryos in their bodies until birth, and this can be either ovoviviparous, and remember that means that the embryos are growing inside the female's body, but they are not receiving any nutrients from her. Or they can be viviparous, which means that they are growing inside her body and she is in some way feeding them. And so it's very general. I know it's very broad, but for fish reproduction, mainly you want to kind of focus or remember the spawning. Now, you guys have probably all heard that fish are one of the species that don't necessarily need a male to reproduce, and there are some species of fish that can reproduce asexually. If you have a group of fish that is solely females and there's no male to fertilize the eggs, then sometimes the females will produce eggs that are unfertilized, of course, but that will grow into adults. Those adults are usually not able to reproduce, so it's not necessarily a condition that you want to carry on forever, because that won't continue on with the species, but it does happen. Okay, so now these fish in the environment, what's the big deal about fish? So first of all, they are very good in ponds and in lakes because they help prevent the overgrowth of algae. Or like we have a pond, or when I was growing up, we had a pond in there. We always used to be duckweed in it, and so we would always stock our ponds so that the fish would eat off all of that stuff. They also control the population of smaller invertebrates. They will eat other aquatic insects or worms or just smaller things in them. So they are, again, kind of a big part of the food chain. Some of them, sharks in particular, are the top of the food chain in their environments, and so their health and their well-being has a big influence on the species below them in that chain. And then for people, they are obviously a food source, and then they are a huge industry. So the health of the fish, the size of the population can be very important to people in lots of different ways. Okay, so now our amphibians. So these are the kind of the slimy ones of this group. They are animals that can live in water and on land, some exclusively in water, some exclusively on land, but they all do need water for reproduction. And there are three main groups or orders. And you first of all have the frogs. There's that little cute guy right up there at the top. And they, of course, are organisms that live in or near water. They have to have the water for reproduction. Toads fall into this group, order Anura, and they obviously don't need as much water, but they do need to remain kind of damp. The caecilians, that next little group, these are legless, burrowing animals. They do have a vertebrae, so they do actually have a skeletal structure. They have a closed circulatory system. They basically are put into this group because of that characteristic. They a lot of times are mistaken for earthworms. They can be very similar in habitat. They look a little different, obviously. They're usually a little bit bigger. but they are actually amphibians. They have the smooth kind of slimy skin we'll talk about in a minute. They're not super harmful. They eat bugs, but they would probably be a little startling if you came upon them. And then the last one, that little cute guy right next to me, that's a salamander. And they, in general, have longer bodies. They have legs that kind of give them a lizard appearance. They are, again, like all the amphibians, they have skin that has kind of a slime to it. They have to remain kind of moist. And of all of the amphibians, they probably go through probably the most extensive metamorphosis. So their stages of life are the most unique from each other. Okay, so now some structure on these guys. So the skin, of course, is kind of a big deal. Their skin is very thin. It has to stay moist, like I've mentioned several times. I know some of you don't like that word, sorry. But they're slimy. Most amphibians secrete a mucus that helps them to kind of retain water, helps them to keep in the moisture that they need. And one of the main reasons for this is that many amphibians do at least some of their breathing through their skin, which means that it has to remain kind of supple and have to have the ability to let gases pass back and forth through it. When we dissect our frog in a couple of days, I will kind of fold back some of the skin so you can see the number of veins that run through their skin. This is because that's where the gas exchange is happening in their circulatory system. So I have to have lots of veins in their skin, and they have to be very close to the surface. Okay, they have a 3-chambered heart, 2 atrias to receive blood, one from the body and then one from the lungs. And then one ventricle, and that's what pumps, the big pump out to the rest of the body. Digestive-wise, they are, as adults, carnivorous. They eat other animals. And those can be insects, they can be other amphibians, smaller frogs, whatever it is, reptiles. They will even eat small mammals. I remember one year when we dissected our frogs, I always have the students cut open the stomachs if they seem big, and there was hair inside one of them, like a little mouse or something had been eaten. So they are tough little guys, and they're hunters. They do have, as part of their digestive system, a kind of a new term for us, a cloaca, and this is the opening that releases solid and liquid waste. Up till now, we really haven't differentiated between what is coming out as waste. But in amphibians, everything comes out of the same spot. It's similar to birds. It's actually the same structure, or it has the same name in birds. And so when they go to the bathroom, everything comes out at once. So pee and poop all together. This also is where eggs and sperm come out during reproduction. So it's kind of a multi-purpose opening, I guess you would say. Then their central nervous system, very advanced, as compared to things we've talked about before. They have a brain that has hemispheres and would look kind of like yours, but of course much smaller. And they do have a spinal cord, and that is the main source for interpreting information about their environments. And then they have a peripheral nervous system, and these are nerves that go throughout the body. They control the animal's movements, and they also report conditions. And so this is what tells a frog to stick its tongue out real fast to catch the fly, and that kind of stuff. And so just like yours, it is an almost instantaneous control. Okay, so now the big deal with these ectotherms. So we didn't really talk about this with fish because they are in water, which has a fairly consistent temperature, and so they just stay that temperature. But amphibians do a little bit more to adjust to their environment. And so in particular, if there are extreme conditions, if it is really, really hot or really, really cold, amphibians can't really handle that, and so they enter into what is called a torpor state. And that's basically like kind of like a zoned out state. It's like some of you, when I'm talking in class, where they're just not doing anything that involves anything other than breathing and staying alive. And they actually really reduce those needs. They breathe very little, or they take in very little oxygen, and they eat nothing at this stage. And so all of their energy just goes into kind of keeping them alive. And depending on the actual condition, this is either called estivation or hibernation. You're probably familiar with the word hibernation, but with estivation, this is extreme heat. And when a frog or a salamander senses that it is going to be very hot, and animals have ways of sensing these that we don't even understand, but in extreme heats or before an extreme heat wave, one of the ways that they use to predict these is if people would notice that the frogs would start to burrow down into the mud at the bottom of a pond or a lake. Like they wouldn't see frogs anymore, and so they'd realize something was going on. And so frogs would burrow down into the mud at the bottom of a pond or a lake before it dried out, if it did, and just basically sit there in the ground. And so this would reduce water loss because they're surrounded by this mud or this damp soil. And the big thing is it would keep their skin moist enough to breathe. Hibernation, same basic process, except now it's really cold. So before the first big cold snap of the year, these amphibians will burrow down again into the ground, usually somewhere close to water again, just for the moisture, and then they will just wait out until the temperature warms back up. So very, very in tune with their environment. Okay, reproduction. So first off, amphibians have mating seasons, and these usually occur during the spring or summer. So during warm, favorable conditions. And they will go through different mating rituals. They will go through different things. The one that we're probably most familiar with is frogs croaking. And those croaks are all of the male frogs calling out to all the ladies out there and saying, okay, I'm ready to mate. And for frogs, this involves external fertilization, and the male will sit behind the female and hold on to her, and as she releases the eggs, he will release sperm. So it's not internal, it is external, but they are very close together, and this position is actually called amplexus, just so you know. The eggs need to be laid in water, and then once they are fertilized, the eggs will grow for a bit, and then they will go through a complete metamorphosis. And you guys have you may have even grown frogs by finding some eggs or finding some tadpoles, and then you can just raise them in a bucket basically, and they will go through the egg stage very briefly, and then they will go through a tadpole stage where they're almost like a fish, and then they will gradually grow legs and gradually lose their tail, and until they become a full frog. And so a complete metamorphosis, big changes from one stage to another. Salamanders use internal fertilization. Some will lay eggs, some will give birth to live offspring. There's all kinds of options here, but probably for the most part it is external fertilization for this group. Okay, last but not least, the amphibians in the environment. So they are a big, big part of the food chain in some areas as predators. Like I said before, they are big hunters. They're eating insects, smaller invertebrates, small mammals, but they are also prey. The tadpoles in particular are a good food source for fish. The frogs are a good food source for snakes, for birds. Some people eat frog legs. And so huge as far as food goes. But another way that amphibians are very important and are studied is because their health is a good indicator of the environmental health in many regions. They are very sensitive to chemicals, they are very sensitive to environmental changes, and they don't always survive them, or they don't always do well with these changes. And so watching the amphibian population has become a really well-used way to determine how environmental changes are affecting the overall population. So it may be one of those things where, if the frog is affected very easily, then we may need to be on the lookout for longer term effects on bigger organisms and even people. So very important, very cool, like I've said about everything else. And anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Bye, guys.